The sound of the bay is never truly silence. It is a living, rhythmic composition of friction and decay. Even here, 30 feet below the deck of the USS Havasu, suspended in a bosun's chair that sways gently with the tide, the world groans. It starts deep in the hull, a low, resonant vibration that travels through the steel plating and into the soles of my boots. It is the sound of 12 massive ships grinding against their fenders, a slow-motion collision that has been happening continuously for 14 months. Above me, the wind cuts through the lattice of the radar mast, creating a hollow, mournful whistle that sounds like someone blowing across the mouth of a giant glass bottle. Below, the brown, silt-heavy water of Suisun Bay slaps against the waterline, a wet, heavy percussion that never stops. I adjusted my grip on the breaker bar. My gloves were slick with a mixture of marine grease and the cold, clammy mist that rolls in from the Golden Gate every morning. I was not fighting a person. I was not fighting the hunger. I was fighting chemistry. Corrosion, I muttered, the word lost to the wind. The patient is terminal. I was staring at the starboard bilge keel of the Havasu, a 1970s-era fleet oiler that served as the northern anchor of our floating city. The steel hull was pitted and scarred, covered in a thick, chaotic map of orange rust and green algae, but my focus was on the rectangular block of gray metal bolted to the hull plate. The zinc anode. The sacrificial lamb. In the world of marine engineering, you accept a simple truth. The ocean wants to eat the iron. It is an electrochemical exchange. The saltwater acts as an electrolyte, creating a battery that strips electrons from the steel, turning a warship into red dust. Unless you give the ocean something tastier to eat, you give it zinc. The zinc gives up its electrons so the steel does not have to. This specific block was wasted, eaten away until it looked like a piece of chewed gray gum. It had done its job. Now it was dead weight. I leaned back, using my legs to brace against the hull, and set the socket onto the retaining bolt. It was a 1.5-inch hex head, encrusted with a year's worth of barnacles and salt spray. I did not just yank on it. That's how you shear a bolt and turn a 10-minute job into a 4-hour nightmare. I took a wire brush from my belt loop and began to scrub the threads exposed at the rear of the nut. The scratching sound was dry and harsh, like fingernails on a chalkboard, as the stiff bristles tore through the calcified growth. I worked methodically. Top bolt, bottom bolt. Clear the threads. Check the integrity of the stud. This is what survival looks like. It is not running through the streets of San Francisco with a shotgun. It is hanging over 40 feet of cold, toxic water, scrubbing a bolt so that a ship does not dissolve. Once the threads were visible, I reached for the penetrating oil. We were running low on the good stuff, the industrial-grade Cono-Croil we'd scavenged from the Benicia maintenance shops, so I was using a homemade mix of transmission fluid and acetone. I applied it carefully, watching the red liquid wick into the rusted threads. I waited. Patience is a resource. In the old world, you could buy time. Now, you have to manufacture it. I looked out across the water while the oil did its work. The fog was lifting, revealing the ghost fleet. We call it the Archipelago. 12 ships, 3 fleet oilers, 4 Victory-class cargo ships from World War II, 2 heavy lift vessels, and 3 flat-deck barges, lashed together in a tight, irregular circle. We had winched them out of the reserve rows and bound them together with heavy braided steel cables, welding gangways between the decks to create a contiguous surface. It looked like a floating favela of gray steel and rust. To the south, the skeletal remains of the Benicia Martinez Bridge spanned the strait. It was jammed solid with cars, a linear parking lot of sun-bleached metal. I could see the glint of windshields, thousands of them. That's where the dead were. The bridge was a choke point, a trap. We were half a mile out, separated by a moat of fast-moving tidal current.
The water here is treacherous. Suisun Bay is where the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers collide with the tide from the San Francisco Bay. The currents are confusing, swirling eddies that can drag a swimmer under and hold them there. It was our primary defense. The swimmers, the infected that washed out of the delta, usually drowned or were battered to pieces against the pilings before they could reach our hulls. Usually. I turned back to the bolt. It had soaked long enough. I set the socket again, verified the fit, and applied torque. I did not jerk the bar. I applied steady, increasing pressure, feeling the metal respond. There is a specific sensation when a rusted fastener breaks free. It's a sudden, sharp release of tension that travels up your arm. Crack. The sound was sharp, like a pistol shot, echoing off the steel hull. The nut turned a quarter rotation. I let out a breath I did not realize I'd been holding. "One down," I whispered. I spent the next 20 minutes wrestling the wasted anode off the studs. It fell into the dark water below with a heavy, wet splash that was immediately swallowed by the current. I pulled the fresh zinc block from the canvas bag hanging next to me. It was heavy, 25 pounds of pure, clean metal. Before I mounted it, I took a flat file and aggressively scraped the mounting points on the hull. This was the step amateurs missed. If the zinc does not have direct, clean electrical contact with the steel, the circuit does not close. The anode sits there looking pretty while the hull rots around it. I filed until I saw the bright silver gleam of raw steel. I bolted the new anode in place, tightening the nuts until my shoulder burned. I checked it twice. Then I wiped the excess grease from the fitting. Discipline. I signaled to the deck crew above. "Haul up!" The electric winch whined, a high-pitched mechanical complaint. It was powered by a portable battery pack we recharged using the solar array on the glacier. I rose slowly, the rivets of the hull passing my face like the dashed lines on a highway. As I cleared the gunnel, hands reached out to grab the harness. It was Miller and Sarah. Miller was a former longshoreman from the port of Oakland, a man built like a refrigerator with hands the size of shovels. Sarah was younger, a structural engineering student from Berkeley who had learned to weld better than anyone on the fleet. "How's she look below?" Miller asked, unclipping my carabiners. "Port side is holding," I said, stepping on to the non-slip deck paint. "But the pitting on the waterline is getting deeper. We need to scrape and paint the forward quarter before winter. If we do not, we're going to lose plate thickness." Miller nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "We do not have the epoxy. Last scout run to the Vallejo dry docks came up dry." "Then we make a mix," I said, unbuckling my harness. "Tar and diesel, whatever seals the pores. We cannot let the rust win, Miller. If the hull goes, the buoyancy goes. If the buoyancy goes, the archipelago breaks its back." I walked to the railing and looked inward, at the heart of our floating city. The space between the lashed ships was a maze of tension cables and improvised bridges. We had welded shipping containers to the decks to serve as workshops and living quarters, reinforcing them with sandbags. On the flat deck of the barge Marseille, in the center of the formation, our agricultural setup was visible. Rows of rainwater collection tarps and plastic tubs filled with composted soil where we grew potatoes and kale. It was ugly. It was industrial. It smelled of diesel, salt, and wet iron. But it was solid.
Systems check in 10, Sarah said, handing me a canteen of warm water. Ramirez says the number 2 generator is vibrating again. Ramirez worries too much. I took a drink. The water tasted slightly metallic, boiled rain stored in an old steel drum. It's a Detroit Diesel 671. It's supposed to vibrate. If it stops shaking, that's when you worry. Still, Sarah pressed. He wants you to listen to it. I'll head to the engine room after I walk the perimeter, I said. Protocol first. The protocol was my religion. In a complex system, failure is rarely linear. It's a cascade.
A missed inspection leads to a seized bearing. A seized bearing leads to a fire. A fire on a ship with limited water pressure leads to death. We walked the perimeter of the archipelago twice a day, checking the mooring lines, the fenders, and the water. I picked up my rifle from the rack near the gangway. It was a Ruger Mini 14, stainless steel barrel. We chose them because the stainless resisted the salt air better than the blued steel of the military M4s. I checked the action, smooth, oiled, and slung it over my shoulder. I began the walk on the Havasu, crossing the welded steel bridge to the SS Solano. The Solano was our barrier ship, positioned on the side facing the open delta. It took the brunt of the weather and the debris. The deck was hot now as the sun burned through the last of the fog. I walked the port rail, scanning the water. The tide was going out, the water rushing past the hull at 4 knots. It carried the wreckage of the continent, uprooted trees, pieces of docks, plastic trash, and occasionally the bloated shapes of the dead. We called the debris field the conveyor belt. I stopped at the midship cleat. Something was caught in the heavy rubber tire fenders hanging off the side. I squinted against the glare. It was a log, a massive redwood trunk that had probably washed down from the northern coast. It was wedged between the hull of the Solano and the floating debris boom we had rigged 20 yards out. But it was not just a log. There was movement on it. I unslung the rifle, bringing the stock to my shoulder. The optic was a simple 4X scope, durable and sealed. I dialed the focus. Huddled on the far side of the log, clinging to the rough bark with gray, distended fingers, was a swimmer. It was naked, its skin bleached bone-white by the immersion, the flesh sloughing off in ribbons. Barnacles had begun to grow on its shoulders. It was not moving much, just riding the log like a tick on a dog. "Control, this is Jack," I spoke into the handheld radio clipped to my vest. "Visual on a hitchhiker. Port side, Solano, Sector 4. "Copy, Jack," came the voice of dispatch, usually Elias, operating from the bridge of the glacier. "Is it a threat to the integrity?" "Negative on structural," I said, watching the creature through the scope. "But it's tangled in the debris boom. If the tide shifts, it could wash up against the fender chains. I'm going to clear it." "Clear to engage. Watch your brass." "Copy." We did not waste brass. Cartridge casings were gold. I fished a small brass catcher bag from my pocket and velcroed it over the ejection port of the Ruger. I breathed in. The smell of the mud was strong today, sulphurous and rich. I rested my elbows on the railing, stabilizing the crosshairs. The ship rose and fell gently, a rhythmic heave of perhaps 2 feet. I had to time the shot with the swell. Inhale. Exhale. Pause. The crosshairs settled on the base of the creature's skull, right where the spine met the brainstem. The creature turned its head, sensing the attention. Its eyes were milky, clouded by cataracts and saltwater damage. It opened its mouth, a black hole in a white face, but the sound of the river drowned out any hiss it might have made. I squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against my shoulder. The report was a sharp crack, swallowed instantly by the vast open space of the bay.
Through the scope, I saw the impact. The creature's head snapped forward violently. It did not flail. It simply went limp, sliding off the redwood log and slipping beneath the murky brown water. The current grabbed it immediately, tumbling it away toward the Golden Gate and the ocean beyond. "Target cleared," I said, checking the chamber. The brass casing was safe in the bag. "Debris boom is still stressed, though. We're going to need to take the skiff out and cut that log loose before the tide turns. If that redwood hits the hull at speed, it'll dent the plating." "Copy that. I'll schedule a detail for low slack," Elias replied. "Get to the engine room, Jack. Ramirez is threatening to shut down the grid if you do not bless his turbine." "On my way." I safed the rifle and continued the patrol. I walked past the converted cargo holds of the Victory, where I could hear the rhythmic grinding of the machine shop.
We had a lathe running, turning a new drive shaft for the water pumps. The sound was comforting. It was the sound of industry. I crossed the gap to the glacier. This was the heart of the grid. The glacier was a refrigerated stores ship, massive and insulated. We used her insulated holds as our primary battery banks and food storage, keeping the temperature stable. I descended into the depths of the ship. The air changed as I went down the narrow steel stairwells. The salt smell faded, replaced by the heavy, oily scent of heated metal and diesel exhaust. The temperature rose. By the time I reached the engine deck, the noise was a physical presence. The Detroit Diesel 671 is a legend for a reason. It's a two-stroke, supercharged beast of an engine that turns noise into electricity. We had salvaged 3 of them from heavy trucks on the mainland and mounted them on vibration dampeners in the glacier's main machine shop. Right now, Unit 2 was running. It was screaming. Ramirez was standing by the control panel, his ear defenders on, watching the analog needles vibrate. He saw me and pointed frantically at the engine block. I walked over, putting on my own earmuffs. The sound dropped to a dull roar, but I could feel the vibration in my teeth. I placed my hand on the valve cover. It was not a rhythmic thrum. It was a stutter, a harmonic dissonance. Thump, thump, rattle, thump. I closed my eyes, visualizing the internal components. Pistons rising and falling. Injectors firing. The blower forcing air into the cylinders. The rhythm was off on cylinder 4. It was a fuel delivery issue. I opened my eyes and grabbed a specialized tool from the rack, a mechanic's stethoscope. I pressed the probe against the injector body of cylinder 4. Instead of the crisp click, click, click of a healthy injector, I heard a wet, muffled squish. I pulled the stethoscope away and signaled to Ramirez. "Cut it!" I shouted, dragging a finger across my throat. Ramirez hit the kill switch. The engine sputtered, shuddered violently, and died. The sudden silence was deafening, leaving a high-pitched ringing in my ears. The auxiliary lights flickered as the system switched over to the battery bank. "What is it?" Ramirez asked, pulling off his headset. "Injectors?" "Worse," I said, wiping oil from the valve cover. "The fuel is turning." I heard the hesitation. "We're getting sludge in the lines again." Ramirez cursed, kicking the steel grating of the floor. "I just changed the secondary filters yesterday. We're burning the stuff from the bottom of the Havasu's number 3 tank. It's thick as molasses." "It's not just sludge," I said, looking at the fuel pressure gauge, which was slowly dropping to 0. "It's microbial. The algae is blooming in the storage tanks. It's clogging the filters faster than we can clean them. If we lose the injectors, we lose the generator. If we lose the generator, the cathodic protection system goes offline." I looked at Ramirez. He looked tired. We all were. But tired is just a feeling. Physics does not care about feelings. We need to polish the fuel, I said. We need to build a centrifuge. A big one. With what? Ramirez threw his hands up. We do not have parts for that. We have the washing machines and the laundry of the Solano, I said, my mind already disassembling the schematic. They have high-speed spin cycles and direct drive motors. We can modify the drums, line them with mesh. We spin the fuel, separate the water and the sludge by centrifugal force before it hits the filters. Ramirez stared at me. Then, slowly, a grin cracked his grease-streaked face. Washing machines? Washing machines, I confirmed. Grab your toolkit. We're going to the laundry room. I looked back at the silent engine. The silence was the enemy. Silence meant the pumps stopped. Silence meant the rust won. Let's go, I said. We have 4 hours of battery life before the lights go out. Clock's ticking. The silence of a dead ship is not peaceful. It is heavy. It presses against your eardrums, a physical weight composed of stagnant air and the absence of the low-frequency mechanical thrum that usually signals life. As Ramirez and I moved from the engine room of the Glacier toward the access gangway, the emergency lighting cast long, sickly yellow shadows against the bulkheads. We had 3 hours and 45 minutes of battery reserve remaining. The battery bank, a sprawling collection of deep-cycle marine lead-acid units and scavenged lithium-ion packs from electric cars, was currently keeping the essential life support online. That meant the bilge pumps, the security perimeter sensors, and, most critically, the circulation pumps for the hydroponics bay. If those stopped, the nutrient film on the roots of our kale and potatoes would dry out in the heat of the enclosed barge. We would lose a harvest that had taken 4 months to cultivate. The laundry, Ramirez grunted, wiping a smear of black grease from his forehead. You seriously want to bet the farm on a laundry cycle? I want to bet on physics, I replied, stepping over a bundle of cables running along the deck. Diesel fuel has a specific gravity of about 0.85. Water is 1.0. The microbial sludge, the biomass, is heavier than the fuel, but lighter than the water. If we spin it fast enough, the laws of motion force the heavy elements to the perimeter. The clean fuel stays in the center. We do not filter it. We separate it. We crossed the welded bridge to the Solano. The air here was colder, damper. The Solano was less insulated than the refrigerated Glacier. It smelled of wet wool and oxidation. The laundry facility was located on the sea deck, a windowless steel box designed to wash the uniforms of 1,000 sailors. We pushed through the double doors. The beams of our headlamps cut through the gloom, illuminating rows of silent, hulking machines. They were industrial Maytag extractors, bolted to the deck, their stainless steel faces dull under a layer of dust. Grab the tool bag, I ordered, dropping my knee pads to the floor. We need the drum assembly and the drive motor from that unit on the end. It's a 60-pound capacity washer. Bigger drum means more volume. Ramirez knelt beside the machine, shining his light into the service panel. These are 3-phase AC induction motors, 220 volts. Our emergency bus is running 24-volt DC. We cannot just plug this in, Jack. I know, I said, pulling a socket wrench from the roll. We're not going to use the ship's AC grid. We're going to wire it directly to the variable frequency drive we pulled from the ventilation fans last month. The VFD can take the DC input from the portable battery pack and synthesize a 3-phase output. It won't be pretty, and the harmonic distortion will probably make the motor scream, but it will spin. I attacked the back panel of the washing machine. The screws were Phillips head, stripped and rusted into place. I did not waste time with the screwdriver. I took a cold chisel and a heavy ball-peen hammer. I set the chisel against the screw head and struck it. The impact rang out like a bell in the confined space, a sharp, biting sound that vibrated through the floor. The screw head sheared off. Efficiency is brutal. I sheared 6 screws in rapid succession. The back panel clattered to the deck, exposing the guts of the machine. A thick rubber belt connected the heavy electric motor to a massive pulley on the back of the stainless steel drum. "Belt looks good," I noted, testing the tension. "Check the bearings. Spin it." Ramirez reached inside the open door of the washer and gave the inner drum a shove. It rotated with a low, dry hiss. "Sounds gritty," he said. "Bearings are dry." "Grease gun," I pointed. "Pack them until they ooze. We need this thing to hit 800 RPM without seizing." While Ramirez worked the grease gun, pumping lithium grease into the bearing race with rhythmic, wet squelching sounds, I focused on the extraction. We did not need the control board, the water pumps, or the soak dispensers. We needed the skeleton. I used a reciprocating saw to cut through the mounting brackets. The saw chewed through the thin sheet metal with a jagged, tearing roar, vibrating my forearms until they felt numb. Sparks showered onto the linoleum floor, dying instantly in the damp air. We wrestled the motor and drum assembly free. It was heavy, an awkward mass of cast iron and steel weighing nearly 200 pounds.
"Lift on 3, I grunted, getting a grip on the motor housing. 1, 2, 3. We heaved the assembly onto a flatbed trolley we had scavenged from the mess hall. The casters squeaked violently as we rolled it out of the laundry room, the sound echoing down the empty corridor like the scream of a dying animal. We moved to the machine shop on the Victory. This was our sanctuary. It was the only place on the archipelago that felt like the old world. The walls were lined with pegboards holding wrenches, calipers, and taps. The air smelled of cutting fluid and ozone. "Time?" I asked, looking at the bulkhead clock. 3 hours 10, Ramirez said. "Batteries are at 78%. Voltage is sagging under load." "We work fast," I said. "I'll fabricate the frame. You wire the VFD." I moved to the welding table. I needed to mount the washing machine drum vertically. In its original life, it spun horizontally to tumble clothes. For a centrifuge, gravity needed to work with us, not against us. I found some scrap angle iron, bed frames we had cut up from the crew quarters. I clamped the steel to the table. I did not have the luxury of precise measurements. I used my handspan and a scribe to mark the cuts. I fired up the oxyacetylene torch. The gas hissed sharply as I opened the valve, a sound like a compressed snake. I struck the striker. Fwump! A blue flame roared to life, the center cone sharp and hot.
Cutting steel is a sensory negotiation. You watch the metal turn cherry red, then bright orange, then a shimmering liquid white. You press the oxygen lever, and the stream of gas blows the molten steel away in a shower of sparks. I cut 4 legs and a cross brace. I switched to the arc welder. I lowered my hood. The world went black, then exploded into green and violent violet light. The sound of welding is a crackle, like frying bacon magnified 1,000 times. I laid a bead of molten metal, fusing the angle iron into a stand. The smell of burning flux filled the shop, a harsh, acrid smoke that tastes like copper on the back of your throat. Behind me, Ramirez was cursing at a tangle of wires. "The VFD is throwing an error code. Low voltage on the DC bus." "Bypass the undervoltage protection," I said, not lifting my hood. "Trick it. Solder a resistor across the sensing terminal. Make it think it has 24 volts even if it drops to 20. "That risks frying the IGBTs, Ramirez argued. "If the transistors blow, we lose the drive." "If we do not clean the fuel, we lose the ship," I countered, finishing the weld.
I chipped the slag off with a hammer, revealing a clean, silver ripple of steel. Do it. We mounted the washing machine drum onto the new vertical frame. It looked like a Frankenstein creation, a stainless steel cylinder suspended in a rusted iron cage with a heavy electric motor bolted to the side.
Now came the plumbing. This was the delicate part. We need a feed line and 2 extraction lines, I explained, grabbing a coil of clear vinyl tubing. We feed the dirty diesel into the center while it spins. The heavy sludge flies to the perforated walls of the drum. We need to catch that sludge and drain it, but the clean fuel will form a vertical wall of liquid closer to the center. I took a piece of copper pipe and bent it into a J shape. I used a tubing cutter, tightening the wheel and spinning the tool around the copper until it snapped cleanly. This is the skimmer, I said, showing it to Ramirez. We mount this so the tip sits exactly 2 inches from the center of the drum. As the fuel spins, the clean diesel will climb up this pipe, driven by its own velocity. We drilled holes in the lid of the washer drum. The drill bit bit into the steel, screaming as it curled up long, sharp ribbons of metal. I secured the copper pipe with epoxy putty, a 2-part gray dough that smelled of rotten eggs and hardened like stone in 10 minutes. Ready to plumb? I said. We dragged the contraption to the fuel settling tank. This was a 500-gallon plastic tote we had positioned on the upper deck of the machine shop. Gravity would feed the dirty fuel into our machine. I connected the lines. The intake hose went from the tote to the center of the drum. The sludge drain, the original water outlet of the washing machine, ran to a waste bucket. The clean fuel line, my copper J-pipe, ran to a clean jerry can. Time check, I called out.
1 hour 40, Ramirez said. His hands were shaking slightly. The main battery bank is down to 40%. The emergency lights are dimming. Moment of truth, I said. Connect the power. Ramirez hooked the heavy gauge cables from the portable battery cart to the VFD. The display on the drive lit up, flickering slightly. Set frequency to 30 Hz to start, I ordered. Slow ramp up. Ramirez turned the dial. The washing machine motor hummed, a magnetic groan that deepened as the torque built. The belt caught, and the heavy stainless steel drum began to turn. Whir, whir, whir. It was off balance. The frame shuddered, walking slightly across the concrete floor. Hold it down, I yelled. I put my weight on the frame. Ramirez joined me. We were 2 men wrestling a vibrating metal beast. Increase speed. We need enough G-force to separate. Ramirez dialed it up to 60 Hz. The motor whined, a high-pitched, piercing frequency that set my teeth on edge. The drum blurred. The vibration smoothed out as the speed increased, transitioning from a violent shake to a terrifyingly potent hum. Open the feed valve, I shouted over the noise. I reached up and turned the ball valve on the dirty fuel line.
Black, viscous diesel, contaminated with the algae sludge, flowed down the clear tube and into the spinning heart of the machine. For a moment, nothing happened. The machine just swallowed the liquid. Then, physics took over. I watched through the clear plastic lid we had bolted on. The black liquid hit the spinning bottom plate and was instantly flung outward. It formed a hollow cylinder of fluid, climbing the walls of the drum. Watch the discharge! I pointed to the waistline. Thick, black goo, a concentrated slurry of water, dead algae, and rust began to spit out of the waste pipe. It looked like crude oil, heavy and gross. Separation achieved, I whispered. Now wait for the clean layer. Inside the drum, a lighter, redder layer of liquid was forming on the inner surface of the spinning wall of fluid. It was the clean diesel, lighter than the sludge, fighting to stay closer to the center. It thickened.
The wall of red liquid grew, creeping inward, closer and closer to the tip of my copper J-pipe. "Come on," I urged it. "Come on." The red liquid touched the copper tip. Suddenly, the clean fuel line jerked. A stream of bright, ruby-red diesel shot out of the tube and into the clean jerry can. It was aerated, frothy, but it was clear. No black specks, no cloudiness. "We have flow!" Ramirez yelled, his voice cracking with relief. "Look at that color! It's beautiful!"
It was the most beautiful thing I had seen in months. It was not just fuel. It was time. It was life. We stood there for 40 minutes, holding the frame steady, watching the jerry can fill. The machine screamed, the motor hot enough to smell, the inverter clicking as it fought the heat. But it held. We processed 20 gallons, enough to run the Detroit diesel for 12 hours. "Shut it down," I ordered. "That's enough for the prime and the first run." Ramirez killed the power. The whine descended in pitch, a dying siren, until the drums slowed to a halt. The silence returned, but it felt different now. It was not the silence of death. It was the silence of anticipation. We hauled the 2 heavy jerry cans back to the glacier. My arms burned with lactic acid. The ship felt steeper, the stairs endless. We reached the engine room with 40 minutes of battery left. The emergency lights were barely glowing filaments now. The darkness was closing in. I poured the warm, centrifuged fuel into the day tank of the number 2 generator. "Prime the lines," I said, grabbing the manual pump handle on the side of the engine block. I pumped. The mechanical resistance of the plunger felt good. Squish, squish. I felt the pressure build. I cracked the bleed screw on the fuel filter housing. A hiss of air escaped, followed by a solid stream of red fuel. No bubbles, no sludge. "System primed," I said, tightening the screw. "Batteries?" "Critical," Ramirez said. "If this does not start on the first crank, we do not have the amps for a second try." I stood before the massive engine. It was a cold lump of iron. I needed to wake it up. "Glow plugs," I said. Ramirez held the switch. 10 seconds. 20. I could hear the relay clicking. The heavy current draw dimmed the room to near total blackness. "Crank it!" Ramirez hit the start button. The starter motor engaged with a heavy metallic clunk, followed by the agonizingly slow groan of the engine turning over. Rrrr, rrrr. It was too slow. The batteries were dying. "Come on, you pig," I whispered, gripping the handrail. Rrrr, rrrr. And then, combustion. A single cylinder fired, a sharp, explosive detonation. Then another. The engine stumbled, coughed, blowing a cloud of black smoke that I could smell instantly. Bang! Bang, bang! The governor caught. The RPMs flared. The slow groan transformed into a rhythmic, thunderous roar. Thrum, 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 thrum. The Detroit Diesel 671 screamed to life, its unique 2-stroke wail filling the engine room. It was loud. It was violent. It was music. Ramirez watched the voltage meter. The needle jumped from the red zone, sweeping up past 110, settling on a steady 120 volts. The main lights flickered and then slammed on, blindingly bright white. The ventilation fans spun up with a rush of air. The floor vibrated with the power of generated electricity. "We are online," Ramirez shouted over the roar, throwing his head back. "Grid is stable." I walked over to the distribution panel and threw the breaker for the cathodic protection system. The green light illuminated. Beneath the water, electrical current was now flowing to the hull, fighting the corrosion, buying us another day against the ocean. Next, I flipped the switch for the hydroponics circulation. The pumps hummed to life. The plants would drink. I slumped against the bulkhead, sliding down until I sat on the vibrating steel grating. I looked at my hands. They were black with grease, cut in 3 places, and shaking uncontrollably from the adrenaline dump. "We need to process another 50 gallons, I said, my voice hoarse. "Or we're doing this again tomorrow." "Let the batteries charge for an hour," Ramirez yelled, patting the screaming engine block like it was a loyal dog. "Then we run the washing machine again." I nodded, closing my eyes for a second. The heat of the engine room was returning, chasing away the damp chill. We had heat. We had light. We had water pressure. But as I sat there, letting the vibration rattle my bones, I thought about the washing machine drum. It was a temporary fix, a jury-rigged solution. The bearings would fail eventually. The belt would snap. The inverter would burn out. We had not solved the problem. We had just pushed it back. I stood up. "I'm going to check the water collection tarps on the Marseille," I said. "With this heat, we might get condensation in the lines. I need to make sure the chlorination drip is synced with the new pump pressure." "Jack," Ramirez said, looking at me with a serious expression, "take a break. Eat something." "Entropy does not take breaks, Ramirez," I said, picking up my rifle. "Neither do I." I left the engine room, stepping back into the brightly lit corridor. The ship was alive again. But as I walked toward the agricultural barge, I could not shake the feeling of the rusted bolt snapping in my hand. The metal was tired. The machines were tired. And so was I. I climbed the ladder to the open deck of the Marseille. The sun was setting, painting the sky over San Francisco in bruised purples and bloody oranges. The wind had picked up, whipping the plastic tarps of the rainwater collectors. I checked the PVC manifold where the collected water fed into the main filtration unit. The pressure gauge read 40 psi. Good. I adjusted the needle valve on the bleach reservoir, watching the slow, steady drip of hypochlorite solution mixing with the raw water. 1 drop every 10 seconds. Enough to kill the bacteria, not enough to poison us. I looked out at the water. The tide was coming in now, reversing the flow of the bay. The conveyor belt of debris would be bringing new gifts from the ocean. And then I saw it, far out. Near the ruin of the Benicia Bridge, a dark shape was moving against the current. It was not drifting. It was cutting a wake. I raised my binoculars. It was not a log. It was not a swimmer. It was a hull. A small, rigid-hulled, inflatable boat, running low in the water, heading straight for the gap between the Havasu and the Solano. There were no lights, no radio hail, just a shadow moving with purpose. I keyed my radio. "Bridge, this is Jack. Contact. Sector south-southeast. Inbound vessel, 1 mile. The radio crackled. "Copy, Jack. Is it salvage?" "Negative," I said, focusing the lenses. I could see silhouettes, 3 of them, and the distinct, angular outline of a weapon mounted on the bow. "They're running dark," I said, my grip tightening on the binoculars. "And they're coming fast. Sound the alarm." The peaceful hum of the generator was suddenly not enough. The systems were running, but the crisis had arrived. The alarm on the glacier does not beep. It is a klaxon, a vintage electromechanical device driven by a heavy copper-wound motor. When Elias triggered it from the bridge, I did not just hear it. I felt the startup current surge through the deck plates. The motor spun up,
the sound rising from a low, guttural moan to a bone-shaking, resonant wail that echoed off the water and the steel hulls of our 12-ship island. It was the voice of the archipelago screaming. I did not run.
Running is how you trip over a tie-down cable and break a leg. I moved with rapid, deliberate purpose, sliding down the ladder from the Marseille to the main thoroughfare of the Solano. Lighting. I keyed my radio. Ramirez, give me the starboard perimeter floods, full draw. I do not care about the battery curve. Energizing bus B. Ramirez's voice came back, tight but controlled. Brace for voltage dip. Above me, the halogens mounted on the king posts of the Solano flickered, buzzed as the ballasts warmed, and then erupted into blinding white brilliance. The light cut through the twilight gloom, turning the black water of Suisun Bay into an illuminated stage. The approaching boat reacted instantly. It did not turn away. The pilot throttled up. The engine note of the intruder vessel shifted from a low drone to a high-pitched, aggressive whine as the hull planed out, skipping over the chop. I reached the gunwale of the Solano just as Miller and Sarah arrived. Miller was carrying a heavy shield made from a cut-up section of a dumpster door, welded with handles. Sarah had her rifle braced on the railing. "Range 400 yards, Sarah called out, her eye pressed to the optic. "They're committed. 3 souls, 1 driver, 2 shooters. That bow mount is a belt fed. Looks like an M240. If they open up, they'll chew through the hull plating." "They are not here to sink us," I said, crouching behind a bollard. You do not bring a machine gun to sink a ship. You bring it to suppress the crew so you can board. They want the fuel. They heard the generator kick on. The physics of the situation were simple and terrifying. We were a stationary target, a massive wall of steel. They were a moving vector, fast and agile. If they got close enough to the hull, inside the dead zone where our deck railings blocked our line of fire, they could grapple the anchor chains or the fender tires and climb up. "Miller, get on the fire monitor," I pointed to the red brass assembly mounted 10 feet down the rail. "Station 2. The fire monitors were our heavy artillery. Designed to fight oil rig fires, they were manually operated water cannons connected directly to the main fire pumps. We had just restored power. The pumps were live. Miller dropped his shield and sprinted for the monitor, grabbing the heavy steel control wheels. "I need pressure," Miller yelled, wrestling the rusted traverse gear. "Ramirez," I shouted into the radio. "Divert auxiliary power to fire pump 1. I need 150 psi at the manifold, now!" "Switching loads. You're gonna lose the mess hall lights. Here it comes." The deck beneath my feet shuddered. Deep in the bowels of the ship, the massive centrifugal fire pump roared to life. I heard the water hammer hit the pipes, a violent, metallic shudder that traveled the length of the ship as the pressure waves slammed into the valves.
"They're opening fire," Sarah yelled. The muzzle of the weapon on the bow of the Arhib flashed, a stroboscopic fluttering of yellow light. A split second later, the air around us shattered. The sound of high-velocity rounds striking the ship was not a continuous noise, but a chaotic series of violent impacts. The steel hull rang like a struck bell, a discordant, vibrating shriek. Bullets sparked off the railing, sending shards of hot copper and lead spinning across the deck. I ducked lower, feeling the percussive snap of supersonic air passing inches above my head. "Hold fire, Sarah," I ordered. "Do not waste rounds on the water. Wait for the climb." The Arhib was closing fast, zigzagging to throw off our aim. They were good. They knew the currents. They were using the wake of the Havasu to shield their approach until the last second. "Miller, sweep the water," I commanded. Miller kicked the release lever on the fire monitor. A jet of salt water, thick as a man's thigh, erupted from the brass nozzle. The sound was a roar, a continuous thundering expulsion of fluid that drowned out the gunfire. The stream hit the water 50 yards out, churning the surface into a white, boiling froth. Miller cranked the elevation wheel, walking the stream outward toward the approaching boat.
The Arhib pilot saw the wall of water coming. He harded to port, trying to cut under the stream. "Lead him! Lead him!" I yelled, watching the geometry of the intercept. Miller fought the recoil of the monitor. The physics were brutal. For every action, an equal and opposite reaction. The monitor pushed back with hundreds of pounds of force, fighting the rusty traverse gears. The boat ducked into the shadow of the Solano's hull. They were under the gun. Too close for the monitor to depress. "They're in the dead zone," Sarah shouted, abandoning the rail. "Heading for the midship ladder. Move! Move!" I scrambled up, keeping my head low. We sprinted along the catwalk toward the midship boarding station, a recessed area where the pilot ladder hung. This was the weak point. I could hear the Rahib engine idling loudly right against the hull. The sound of shouting voices drifted up, distorted by the wind and the adrenaline pounding in my ears. Then came the metallic clang of a grappling hook striking the gunwale. A three-pronged steel hook grabbed the rail, biting into the paint. The rope went taut instantly. "Cut it!" I yelled, pulling my knife. But before I could reach the rope, a hand appeared over the rail. Then a head. Wearing a ballistic helmet and a gas mask, the intruder moved with terrifying speed. He did not climb like a man, he vaulted like a gymnast, using the momentum of the rope to swing himself over the rail. He landed on the deck in a crouch, raising a compact submachine gun. Sarah fired. The Ruger kicked against her shoulder. The report was deafening in the narrow corridor between the deck cargo. The round hit the intruder in the chest plate. The impact did not penetrate the ceramic armor, but the kinetic energy was undeniable. It knocked him backward, off balance. He stumbled, his boots skidding on the wet steel. He squeezed the trigger of his weapon as he fell. A spray of 9mm rounds chewed into the bulkhead next to my head, sending a cloud of rust dust and paint chips into my eyes. I did not have a clear shot. Miller was behind me. I did the only thing I could. I used the ship. Directly next to the intruder was the manifold for the deck washdown system. It was a 2-inch valve, pressurized by the same pump feeding the monitor. I lunged forward, not at the man, but at the wheel. I grabbed the iron rim and wrenched it counterclockwise. The valve was stiff, but adrenaline is a powerful lubricant. It cracked open. A concentrated blast of high-pressure salt water exploded from the open fixture. It was not a stream. It was a solid bar of water moving at 80 miles an hour. It caught the intruder squarely in the side. The physics were instantaneous. The human body cannot maintain traction against that kind of mass flow. He was lifted off his feet, sliding violently across the slick steel deck. He slammed into the scuppers, the water pinning him against the railing with the force of a hydraulic press. He flailed, trying to regain his footing, but the relentless pressure held him down. His gas mask was awash. He was drowning on dry land. "Miller! The rope!" I shouted. Miller surged past me, his heavy boots stomping down on the intruder's wrist where he gripped the railing. There was a sickening crunch of small bones breaking. The intruder's hand opened. Miller slashed the grappling rope with a machete. The tension released. The rope whipped away into the dark. "Man overboard!" Miller yelled, kicking the intruder. With a final shove from Miller's boot, aided by the deluge of water, the raider tumbled over the side. He hit the water with a heavy splash. I spun the valve closed. The roar of the water died instantly, leaving only the ringing in my ears and the sound of the rib's engine revving frantically below. I ran to the rail, rifle raised. The rib was peeling away, the pilot abandoning his comrade. The man in the water was thrashing, weighed down by his armor, caught in the swirl of the current and the backwash from the boat. "Let them go," Sarah said,
her voice shaking. She kept her rifle trained on the retreating boat. "They're running." The rib disappeared into the darkness, its wake a white scar on the black water.
The man in the water struggled for another few seconds. Then the current of the Carquinez Strait took him. He was pulled under. Just another piece of debris in the conveyor belt. "Cease fire," I said, breathing hard. "Secure the perimeter." I looked at the deck. It was a mess of water, spent brass, and blood. But we were intact. Then the ship groaned. It was not the usual sound of metal settling. It was a high-pitched, screaming tear, followed by a thunderous boom that shook the deck so hard I nearly lost my footing. "What was that?" Miller shouted, looking aft. My radio screeched. "Jack, this is Elias. We have a catastrophic failure on the stern coupling. The winch. They shot the hydraulics on the tension winch." My stomach dropped. The Solano and the Havasu were held together by massive steel cables kept under tension by hydraulic winches. If the hydraulics failed, the tension released. "Movement," Sarah pointed to the bridge connecting us to the Havasu. The welded steel gangway, a solid structure of I-beams and grating, was twisting. The two ships were drifting apart. The gap between them, usually a fixed 4 feet, was widening. 6 feet. 8 feet. The welds shrieked as the steel tore. "The archipelago is breaking apart," I yelled. "Miller, get to the manual brake on the winch. Sarah, get the chain falls from the shop. We have to bind them before the gangway shears." I sprinted toward the stern. This was the real crisis. The gunfight was just the catalyst. The enemy was now momentum and mass. I reached the winch deck. The scene was a nightmare of industrial violence. A stray round from the rib's machine gun had punched through the hydraulic reservoir of the port tension winch. Hydraulic fluid, hot, red, and slippery, was spraying everywhere, coating the deck and the machinery. The drum of the winch was freewheeling, spinning wildly as the cable paid out. The heavy steel wire was whipping around, a deadly lash capable of cutting a man in half. "Do not touch the cable," I screamed at Miller, who was reaching for the manual brake wheel. "It's moving too fast. It'll burn the brake pads in seconds." We watched helplessly as the cable went slack, splashing into the water between the ships. With the tension gone, the tidal current pushed the Solano away from the Havasu. The gangway connecting them groaned again. The metal was stretching, deforming. Rivets popped with sounds like pistol shots, flying into the air. If that gangway falls, it takes the main power bus with it, I realized. The thick copper cables carrying the power from the glacier's generators ran underneath that walkway. "We need to pull them back together," I said, my mind racing. "We cannot use the winch. It's dead." "The anchor windlass," Miller gasped, wiping hydraulic fluid from his face. "The forward anchor windlass on the Havasu." If we can run a line to it, we can use its power to heave us back in.
"That's a 200-foot throw across moving water," I said. "We cannot throw a line that heavy." "The pneumatic line thrower," Sarah said, arriving with the heavy chains. "In the emergency locker, the one for breeches buoys." "Get it," I ordered. "Miller, prep a messenger line. I'm going to isolate the hydraulic leak." I waded into the slick of hydraulic fluid. The smell was overpowering, acrid, hot oil. I slipped, my knees slamming into the steel deck, but I scrambled to the winch housing. I needed to cap the line so we did not lose all the fluid in the central system. My hands were uselessly slick. I could not grip the shutoff valve. "Rag!" I yelled. I did not wait. I ripped the sleeve off my shirt and wrapped it around the valve handle. I strained against it. The valve was frozen. "Come on!" I gritted my teeth, putting my entire body weight into the turn. The valve screeched and moved. I twisted it shut. The spray of hot oil stopped. Line thrower ready, Sarah shouted. She was kneeling on the edge of the widening gap. The Havasu was now 12 feet away. The power cables underneath the gangway were pulled taut, vibrating like guitar strings. If they snapped, the arcing electricity would start a fire we could not put out. Aim for the bollard cluster on the Havasu bow, I directed. Sarah raised the orange pneumatic launcher.
It looked like a musket. She aimed high to compensate for the wind. Thump! The projectile, a heavy rubber weight attached to a thin nylon line, arced through the air. It trailed the yellow cord behind it. It cleared the gap and landed with a clatter on the steel deck of the Havasu. "Ramirez!" I screamed into the radio. "Get a team on the Havasu bow. Secure that line to the windlass and haul in. We're sending the heavy cable." "I see it," Ramirez replied. "We're moving." We tied the nylon messenger line to a heavier braided rope and tied that rope to the eye of a spare steel mooring cable. "Haul away!" On the Havasu, figures scrambled in the darkness. They grabbed the line and began to pull. We fed the cable out by hand, hand over hand, burning our gloves. The gap was 15 feet. The gangway welds were tearing. One of the I-beams snapped with a sound like a cannon shot, leaving the walkway hanging precariously by one side. "Faster!" I yelled. The heavy steel cable snaked across the gap. Ramirez's team threw the eye over the windlass drum on their side. "Heave in!" The steam-powered windlass on the Havasu, converted to run on compressed air, began to turn. The cable went taut. It lifted out of the water, shedding droplets that sparkled in the floodlights. Creak. Groan. The massive inertia of the Solano fought the cable. For a second, I thought the wire would snap. It sang a high, deadly note. Then, slowly, agonizingly, the gap began to close. 14 feet. 12 feet. The gangway shrieked as the pressure on it was relieved. "Keep it coming," Miller yelled, guiding the cable onto our bollard to belay it. When the ships bumped back together, the sound was a deep, resonant thud that shook the fillings in my teeth. The fenders compressed. The island was whole again. "Secure it," I ordered. 3 figure-8s. Lock it down." Miller threw the heavy loops of wire over the bit. We lashed it tight. I slumped against the winch housing, covered in red hydraulic fluid, sweat, and grime. My chest was heaving. I checked the power cables under the broken gangway. The insulation was stretched and white, but the copper held. The lights were still on. "Crisis contained," I whispered into the radio. "Status check." "We're secure," Ramirez's voice came back. "But the gangway is totaled. We cannot cross between ships safely until we weld supports. And Jack, the Solano took hits below the waterline. I'm seeing water in the number 4 bilge." I closed my eyes. Of course. The bullets. "Start the bilge pumps," I said, pushing myself up. "And get the welding cart. We're not sleeping tonight." I looked out at the dark bay. The rib was gone. The intruder was gone. But they had left their mark. They had proven that our fortress was fragile. It was not just the rust and the hunger anymore. It was the intelligence of others. I walked over to where Sarah was coiling the line. She looked shaken. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded, but her hands were trembling. "I killed him, Jack. Or the water did." "The situation killed him," I said, putting a hand on her shoulder. My hand left a bloody, oily smear on her jacket. "We kept the lights on. That's the job." I looked at the broken winch, the snapped railing, the puddle of fluid. This was the cost of business. "Let's get to work," I said. "The rust never sleeps, and neither do we." The silence returned to the archipelago, but it was thinner now.
We were awake. We were aware. And we were broken in new ways that required fixing. I picked up my toolbox. The night was young, and there was a hole in my ship. The adrenaline crash is a physiological tax that the body collects with brutal interest. It does not happen immediately. It waits until the immediate threat is neutralized, until the heart rate drops below 100, and then it strikes. It feels like someone has replaced your blood with wet sand. I was standing thigh-deep in the bilge water of the Solano, 3 decks down, fighting the urge to vomit. The space was tight, a narrowing wedge of steel where the hull curved inward toward the keel. The air was thick with the smell of diesel, rust, and the swampy, organic odor of the bay water that had intruded.
The only light came from the erratic beam of my headlamp and the portable work light Miller had hung from a pipe overhead. "Pump is cavitating," Miller said. His voice was flat, stripped of emotion. He was leaning against a bulkhead, watching the black hose of the portable trash pump vibrate. "It's catching air," I replied, wading forward. The water was cold, a numbing chill that penetrated my canvas trousers instantly. "That means the level is dropping. We're winning." I reached the hull plating. The damage was easy to find. 3 jagged holes punched through the half-inch steel by the Raider's machine gun. They were clustered in a tight group, about 2 feet above the turn of the bilge. Sunlight, or rather the moonlight reflected off the water, should not be visible this deep in a ship. But there it was. 3 faint, shimmering stars of intrusion where the water pulsed in with every roll of the vessel. "Hand me the plugs," I said. Miller passed me a canvas bag of damage control plugs, conical wedges of soft pine wood. They were low-tech, ancient maritime technology. I took the mallet from my belt. I selected a plug that looked slightly larger than the first bullet hole. I jammed the point into the jagged tear in the steel. I swung the mallet. The impact was a dull, wet thud that did not echo. The wood compressed, biting into the sharp edges of the torn metal. I hit it again, and again. With each strike, the spurting stream of water diminished until it was just a weep. "Wood swells when it gets wet," I muttered, more to myself than Miller. "Nature's gasket." I plugged the other 2 holes. The immediate rushing sound of ingress stopped, replaced by the rhythmic, slurping noise of the bilge pump sucking the remaining water from the floor. "That's the triage," I said, wiping salt spray from my face. "Now we need a permanent fix. We cannot weld here. The fuel tank is right behind this bulkhead. If we strike an arc, the heat transfer could ignite the vapors. We'd blow the Solano in half." "Box patch?" Miller suggested. "Box patch," I agreed. "We need a 12 by 12 steel plate, a 1/4 inch thick. Drill 4 corners. We'll use a neoprene gasket. Cut up one of the diving suits if we have to, and bolt it through using toggle bolts. We seal it from the inside." "I'll go to the shop," Miller said. He turned to leave, wading through the receding water, but stopped. He did not look back at me. He looked at the rusted frame of the ship. "Jack." "Yeah?" "They knew where to hit us," he said quietly. "They did not shoot at the bridge. They did not shoot at the people. They shot at the water line and the winch. They were engineers." I stared at the wooden plugs, watching a single drop of water form on the end of the pine. "Yes," I said. "That's what scares me too. The dumb ones starve. The smart ones, they become this." Miller nodded and climbed the ladder, his boots ringing heavily on the rungs. I stayed in the bilge for another 10 minutes, watching the plugs. I had to be sure. This is the curse of the mechanic. You never trust the fix until you've watched it endure the load. I listened to the ship. The groans were different now. The tension on the cables had changed, shifting the center of gravity. The archipelago was rebalancing itself like a wounded animal shifting its weight off an injured leg. I climbed out of the hole, my muscles burning with a fatigue so deep it felt structural. By the time I reached the main deck, the sun was beginning to bleed into the eastern sky over the delta. It was a gray, diffused light that turned the fog into a wall of pearl. The wind had died down, leaving the water flat and oily. The damage to the gangway between the Solano and the Havasu was ugly in the daylight. The steel grating was twisted upward like a piece of crumpled paper. The I-beam support was sheared, hanging by a thread of bent metal. We had lashed the ships together with the cable, pulling them tight, but the scar remained. I walked to the mess container on the Victory. The smell of coffee hit me before I opened the door. It was not real coffee. We ran out of that 6 months ago. It was a brew made from roasted chicory root and dandelion we scavenged from the hillsides near Martinez. It was bitter, black, and hot. That was enough. Inside, the crew was gathered. There were only 12 of us left in the core group now. Faces were pale, drawn. Sarah was sitting at the long communal table, staring into her mug. Her hands were wrapped around the ceramic so tight her knuckles were white. I poured a cup and sat across from her. I did not say anything. I just drank the hot, bitter liquid and let the warmth spread through my chest. "The gangway is impassable," I announced to the room. My voice sounded gravelly, foreign. "We'll need to cut the damaged section away and weld in a replacement. We have some spare grating on the Marseille. It's a 2-day job." "And the hydraulic winch?" Elias asked from the corner. He was rubbing his eyes. "Total loss," I said. "The reservoir is shattered. The pump housing is cracked. We'll have to strip it for parts and rely on the manual windlass for tensioning. It means we cannot adjust for the tide as quickly. If we get a king tide or a storm surge, we'll have to man the capstans around the clock." Silence settled over the table. It was not a fearful silence. It was the heavy, resigned silence of people who have just been handed a longer work shift at the end of a double shift. "We need to talk about the ammo," Sarah said. She did not look up. "I used 20 rounds. Miller used the fire monitor. We burned a lot of diesel for the pumps." "We survived," Ramirez said gently. "Did we?" Sarah looked up then. Her eyes were red-rimmed. "They tested us. They came in fast, identified our weak points, forced us to light up the grid, and then left. They did not retreat because they were losing. They retreated because they got the data they wanted. They know we have power. They know we have fuel. They know our reaction times." She was right. I knew she was right. "We changed the patrol patterns," I said, leaning back. The metal chair dug into my spine. "We install blinders on the floodlights so we do not illuminate the deck when we light up the water. And we start building the heavy nets." "Nets?" Elias asked. "Torpedo nets," I explained. "Old World War I tech. We string heavy chain-link fencing and steel cable from the outriggers, suspended 10 feet off the hull. If a boat tries to ram us or come alongside, they hit the net before they hit the ship. It fouls their props. It keeps them in the open." "That's miles of cable," Miller said, walking in from the shop. He looked exhausted. "Weeks of welding." "What else do we have to do?" I asked. "We do not have Netflix, Miller. We have work. Work keeps the rust off." It was a grim joke, but a few people smiled. The tension in the room broke, just a fracture. We were mechanics. Give us a problem, we feel helpless. Give us a task,
and we feel alive. I finished my chicory. I'm going to check the greenhouse. Then I'm sleeping for 4 hours.
Elias, you have the watch. I walked alone to the Marseille. The transition between the ships was always a reminder of the fragility of our existence. I stepped over the gap where the water churned below, green and hungry. The agricultural bay was our cathedral. We had cut away the center deck of the barge and installed a translucent roof made from salvaged greenhouse panels and polycarbonate sheeting. Inside, the air was warm and humid, smelling of damp earth and tomato vines. It was the only place on the archipelago that did not smell like decay. I walked the rows of PVC pipes. The nutrient film technique, NFT system, was humming quietly. The pumps I had worried about earlier were pushing the nutrient-rich water through the channels. I stopped at the kale beds. The leaves were dark green, crinkled and robust. They did not know the world had ended. They only knew that the pH was 6.0 and the nitrogen levels were adequate. I reached out and touched a leaf. It felt waxy and alive. This was the counter-argument to the entropy. Outside, the salt was eating the steel. The UV radiation was breaking down the paint. The tides were trying to tear the ships apart. But in here, we were creating order. We were taking sunlight and water and chemicals and turning them into calories. I checked the reservoir tank. The water level was good. The temperature was holding at 72 degrees. Competence, I whispered. It was my mantra. It was not about hope. Hope is a passive emotion. It's waiting for something good to happen. Competence is active. It is the application of will against chaos. I sat down on a plastic crate near the tomato vines. I let the humidity soak into my skin, easing the stiffness in my joints. I closed my eyes. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine the future. Not the fantasy of a rescue. The government was gone. The military was fractured into warlords. But the reality of next year. If we built the nets, we could secure the perimeter. If we managed the fuel cleaning, the generators would last another 5 years. By then, maybe we could figure out how to distill ethanol from the corn we were trying to grow on the Victory. Maybe we could retrofit the boilers to run on biofuel. We could last. We could endure. We would not go back to the way things were, but we would not disappear. We would become a fixture of the bay, a permanent reef of steel and life. The Iron Archipelago would become a legend to the scavengers on the shore, the place that never went dark. The thought brought a strange, melancholy comfort. We were the monks of the new dark age, and our scripture was the technical manual. I woke up with a start. I had dozed off sitting on the crate. The sun was fully up now, turning the translucent roof into a glowing white canopy. I stood up, stiff and sore. My shoulder ached where the rifle strap had dug in. My hands were stained with oil that no amount of scrubbing would ever fully remove. I left the greenhouse and climbed the ladder to the highest point on the archipelago, the radar mast of the Havasu. The view from up here was absolute. To the west, the bay opened up toward San Francisco. I could see the faint, jagged outline of the city in the distance, a silhouette of broken teeth against the horizon. To the east, the delta wound its way into the interior, a maze of sloughs and islands where the dead things drifted. I keyed the microphone on the long-range transmitter. It was a ritual. We broadcast once a day at solar noon when the ionosphere was most reflective. We ran low power, just enough to reach the valley and the coast. I checked the SWR meter. The needle barely moved. The antenna was tuned. CQ, CQ,
CQ, I spoke into the handset. My voice was calm, the voice of a man reading a shipping manifest. This is Archipelago Control, frequency 14225. We are transmitting from the confluence. I paused, listening to the static. It was a white noise hiss, the sound of the universe breathing. If you can hear this, check your equipment, clean your terminals, verify your grounds. The static you hear is the sound of systems failing. Do not let yours fail. I looked down at the deck of the Solano. I could see Miller and a team of 3 others welding the support brackets for the new gangway.
I saw the flash of the arc, a tiny blue star in the daylight. I saw the smoke rising. We had a breach last night, I continued, speaking to the ghosts in the airwaves. We took water. We took damage. But we are still floating. We are still generating. I watched the water flowing past the hull. The tide had turned again. The water was rushing out, cleaning the bay, carrying the dead out to sea. The world is trying to take you apart, I said. It wants to turn your iron into rust and your wood into rot. It is patient. It is relentless. You have to be more relentless. Look at your shelter. Look at your tools. If something is broken, fix it today, not tomorrow. Today. I thought of the raiders, the man in the water, the choice we made to hold the line. We are not a safe harbor, I said. We are a machine, and machines require maintenance. If you are out there, if you are listening, maintain your position. Maintain your discipline. Competence is the only currency left. I released the key. I did not wait for a response. There never was one. Or if there was, it was lost in the interference of a broken world. I hung up the handset. Below me, the grinder started up. The sound was harsh, a high-pitched scream of metal on metal. It cut through the wind. It was loud. It was abrasive. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. I climbed down the ladder. It was time to mix the epoxy for the hull patch. The rust was not going to wait, and I was the only one who knew the correct ratio. The work continued.